The best decision he ever made. Leaving you was the best decision I ever made." Bradley Kessler said it with a smile and a champagne flute in his hand, standing 3 feet from me under a white reception tent outside Wilmington, while my cousin's string trio drifted through a slow jazz standard like the universe had a mean sense of timing. There were roughly 110 people under that tent, more if you counted the catering staff moving between tables with trays of shrimp and grits shooters and champagne. My mother sat 2 chairs to my left. Bradley's mother, Louise, stood 20 feet away in dove-gray silk, pretending not to notice her younger son humiliating his ex-wife at a family wedding. I didn't answer him. I just looked at his face and thought, for one strange, detached second, that he had aged exactly the way bitterness ages a man who mistakes charm for character. The corners of his mouth still knew how to lift on cue. His cufflinks caught the amber light strung through the tent. But there was a grayness settling around his eyes that hadn't been there when I was 41, and foolish enough to believe being loved and being safe were close cousins. Then a little girl in a pale yellow dress came barreling across the dance floor, wrapped both arms around my knees, and pressed her cheek into my skirt. "I love you, Mommy." The tent went so quiet I could hear a fork click against china at the head table. Behind me, the flap opened. Men's dress shoes crossed the wood flooring. I didn't need to turn around to know who had walked in. I'd learned the cadence of his step by then, the measured pace of a man who'd spent half his career walking into rooms where people either lied for a living or told the truth because they had no other option left. That was the moment Bradley Kessler learned that 5 years is a long time to underestimate a woman he'd once mistaken for manageable. "My name is Josephine Larkin. Joe, to the people who've earned it." I was 46 that night at my cousin's wedding, a senior probate paralegal in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the mother, by every measure that mattered except biology, of a 5-year-old girl I hadn't given birth to but loved with the ferocity of something the world had handed me after taking a knife to the rest of my life. This is the story of the night my husband betrayed me with my best friend, and of the 5 years I spent learning that silence isn't surrender, grief isn't weakness, and leaving with your dignity intact can be the first move in a reckoning nobody sees coming. 5 years earlier, on my 41st birthday, I left work at 4:30 because Bradley had texted me 3 times before lunch to make sure I'd be home by 6. "Don't be late, birthday girl. Got a surprise I should tell you now." Bradley never loved surprises for other people. He loved control. He loved the reveal, the performance of generosity. The part where people looked at him and thought, "What a thoughtful husband. What a polished man." If he bought flowers, he wanted them photographed. If he booked a table, he wanted the hostess to recognize his name. At 41, I already knew this about him and had begun filing it under truths I didn't say out loud. I worked at a probate and estate litigation firm on Front Street, in a brick building with narrow windows and an elevator that groaned on every floor. My days were spent inside other people's endings: wills, trusts, family land disputes, bitter daughters, bewildered widowers, handwritten codicils found in desk drawers after funerals. I was good at the work because I understood that the ugliest things people do often happen in rooms with nice lamps and framed wedding photos. Greed doesn't arrive wearing a sign. It arrives with a casserole or a husband who says he made dinner reservations for your birthday. That afternoon, I left with a lemon cake from the bakery downstairs, because my assistant Renee insisted no woman should go home on her birthday empty-handed, husband's surprise or not. I balanced the box on the passenger seat and drove through Wilmington traffic with the windows cracked, the smell of a brief spring shower still steaming off the pavement. Bradley had been odd for months by then, though odd is the kindest word for a man already arranging his life around lies. He worked in wealth management, or rather, he liked to say he did. What he actually did shifted every 6 months depending on which business card he'd most recently ordered. Investment advisory, legacy planning, boutique consulting. He wore navy suits, shook the right hands, spoke in polished paragraphs about portfolio strategy while forgetting to pay the electric bill. He knew the language of money far better than he understood the discipline required to keep any of it. For most of our marriage, I'd mistaken his confidence for competence. I'd also mistaken my best friend's loyalty for love. Simone Foley had been in my life for 14 years by then. We met when I was 26, still learning how to look older than my face in legal offices where senior attorneys called every woman under 30 girls, regardless of how many estates she was quietly holding together. Simone was funny in a bright, reckless way that made rooms feel less formal. She worked in private trust administration at a regional bank and knew more about old Carolina money than anyone I'd ever met who hadn't inherited any. We had brunch every other Sunday. She had a key to my house. She'd stood beside me in my own kitchen, frosting Bradley's 40th birthday cake, telling me I was the only person who really knew her. If you'd asked me at 41 who would never betray me, I'd have given you 2 names without hesitation. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it should. Porch light on. Bradley's car in the drive. Warm light through the kitchen windows. For one stupid second, I smiled. I carried the cake in one hand, my laptop bag in the other, and called out his name. No answer. Music somewhere upstairs, soft and old-fashioned, too low to place. I smelled seared steak, butter, and Simone's perfume, the sweet, expensive kind she wore when she wanted to feel invincible. I stood very still. People talk about intuition like thunder. Mine has never worked that way. Mine is quieter. The small internal shift when the room stops making sense and some disciplined part of your mind begins taking inventory before your heart can start lying to you. Simone's perfume. At 6 o'clock, in my house, I climbed the stairs without calling out again. I remember noticing absurd things. The second step still creaked on the left. The hallway lamp needed a bulb. Bradley's loafers were kicked halfway under the bench outside our bedroom door, which stood open 3 inches, light spilling through the gap. Simone was in my bed, wearing my husband's dress shirt and nothing else. Bradley sat shirtless against the headboard, one hand on her thigh, wearing the expression of a man caught in the middle of something he'd already decided to justify. No one screamed. No one lunged. Simone's face went white first. Bradley said my name the way people say wait right before they lie. Joe. I looked at the bed, then at the chair by the window where Simone's black dress hung neatly over the arm. My gold bracelet, the one my mother gave me for my 39th birthday, was looped around the strap of her purse like she'd absent-mindedly taken it off after dinner. Then I saw the laptop. Open on Bradley's side of the bed, screen still awake, a document glowing in the dim room. At first I only registered the familiar formatting of trust paperwork, distribution columns, account notes, signatures. Then my eyes caught the header. Kessler Family Charitable Trust, Louise Kessler, was Bradley's mother, and beneath the summary sat a transfer notation that made the air in my lungs go cold. I stepped past the bed before either of them could stop me and lifted the laptop with both hands. Joe, don't. I held up one hand without looking at him. Don't speak. My voice didn't sound like mine. Flatter, cleaner. Simone pulled the sheet to her chest. This isn't what it looks like. No, I said. It's worse. The room went silent, except the low hum of the bedside lamp. A transfer had been flagged, then manually reversed. Initials in the note field that weren't Bradley's and weren't Louise's. A date from 3 weeks earlier. A reference to a sub-account Louise had established for charitable giving after Bradley's father died. And in the corner, the watermark of the trust office where Simone worked. I didn't need 10 seconds to understand the shape of it. Not the whole story yet, but enough. My husband was sleeping with my best friend. My best friend had access to his mother's trust paperwork. Both of them were sitting in my bedroom with financial evidence open between them, on my birthday, like they'd gotten careless enough to believe I'd never be the woman who walked in before dessert. I closed the laptop, picked up Simone's dress, and dropped it at her feet. Get dressed. Then, to Bradley. By the time I come back for the rest of my things, I want every password to every joint account written down and left on the kitchen counter. If $1 moves tonight, I will know. He stared at me like he'd never heard me speak before. Maybe he hadn't. By midnight, I knew my marriage was over. By 1 in the morning, sitting at my mother's kitchen table with Bradley's laptop open between us and a legal pad under my hand, I knew the affair was the smallest part of what they'd done. My mother's kitchen had always been the room where facts sounded less frightening. Not because the room was soft. Beatrice Larkin was not a soft woman. A retired middle school principal with silver hair and a spine like a ruler, she listened to bad news with her hands folded so neatly in her lap, you'd mistake her calm for indifference if you didn't know better. That kitchen had held every hard thing that had ever happened to me. My father's funeral casseroles. My burst appendix at 22. The morning I told her I thought marrying Bradley might be a mistake, and married him 6 months later anyway. She set the kettle down, looked once at my face, then the screen. What did you see besides the obvious? That was why I'd gone to her instead of a friend. She had no patience for reaction that wasted energy before the facts were arranged. I turned the laptop toward her, pointed at the transfer log. This is Louise's charitable sub-account. Bradley shouldn't have direct access. Simone definitely shouldn't have anything from the trust office on his personal computer. What am I looking at? A reversal entry. Something moved out, then back in. Maybe someone got nervous. Maybe someone realized the paper trail was too obvious. I leaned closer. See that notation? References an interim disbursement approval. Louise would never authorize one without copying Weston. My mother knew Bradley's family the way Wilmington women know each other's histories without admitting how much they know. Weston Kessler, Bradley's older brother, was the serious one, a corporate attorney with careful eyes and a clean record. Can you prove what this means? She asked. Not tonight. Can you prove what it might mean? I looked up. She stood at the counter in her blue cotton robe. No pity in her face, no panic. Just that old principal's expectation that if I was bringing a problem into the room, I'd better be ready to think my way through it. Yes, I said. I think I can. She gave a short nod. Then sit there and think. I'll make tea anyway. I didn't sleep that night. I made a list instead. 20 years around probate files teaches you that betrayal rarely arrives with fireworks. Most of the time it arrives by incremental trespass. A nephew borrowing a checkbook, a daughter persuading a father with dementia to sign a deed, a brother who says he's only helping with paperwork. The first rule is simple. Don't trust your memory alone. Write everything down before shame or fatigue rearranges it into something easier to bear. What I know for certain. Bradley and Simone were having an affair. Simone's trust office watermark appeared on a Kessler family document open on Bradley's personal laptop. The transfer referenced Louise's charitable sub-account. The entry had been reversed. The notation was 3 weeks old. The laptop had been open in my bedroom while my husband and my best friend were in my bed. The second page was uglier, because it required me to stop pretending the last year had been normal. Bradley had been asking more questions about trust structures lately, in that casual tone people use when they want curiosity to sound harmless. How do successor trustees work again? Can a beneficiary request a temporary distribution if the primary trustee is elderly? I'd answered the way wives answer husbands who seem interested in your job. I thought he was making conversation. Simone had been dropping Louise's name into conversation too. Never alarming at the time, just the way trust officers talk around confidentiality without quite breaking it. You'd be amazed how many people think they can use a charitable sub-account as a family slush fund if nobody's watching. Once, over dinner, she'd laughed and said if she ever handled her best friend's in-laws' money, she'd recuse herself immediately. I'd laugh too, because it sounded hypothetical. Bradley had started going to Louise's house to help with paperwork after his father's death, though she'd always kept every statement in color-coded folders. He'd complained once that Weston was too controlling about the trust. You'd think he was the only son in the family. Simone had canceled brunch twice in a month for late meetings at the bank. One of those evenings, Bradley had come home, smelling like her perfume, claiming he'd been with a client. I remember standing at the stove thinking, for half a second, that's Simone's perfume, Then telling myself I was tired and suspicious and mean-spirited for even thinking it. Women waste years trying to be fair to people who are busy betraying them. At 2, my mother set toast in front of me I didn't touch. I was zooming in on the trust document's tiny note field. Bradley hadn't been careful with his browser history either. In the recent documents folder sat 3 more files connected to Louise's trust: a scanned authorization form with her signature, a spreadsheet of sub-account balances, and an email draft, never sent, addressed to Simone's work account. Subject line: need this before Weston sees quarterly statement. I sat back so abruptly my chair scraped the tile. My mother looked up. What? I turned the screen. She read the subject line and pressed her lips together. Well, she said, that answers whether this is just adultery. No, I said. It isn't just adultery. We worked until 3:30. My mother asked the questions that kept me from drowning in the emotional part of it. What date was the first transfer? Did the reversal happen before or after Louise's last luncheon? Did Weston know anything was wrong? That last question stayed with me. Weston had always unsettled me a little. Not because he was unkind, but because he seemed to see more than he said. 10 years older than Bradley, dark-suited, measured, with a gaze that lingered long enough to make you feel he'd noticed every omission in your story. At our wedding, while Bradley worked the crowd like a man campaigning for office, Weston had stood near the back of the garden and watched, like someone taking notes for a future he hoped not to need. Twice in the past year, he'd asked if I was all right. Once at Louise's Christmas party, when Bradley had disappeared for an hour and Simone showed up late with wine a client had supposedly given her. Weston had found me in the kitchen and said quietly, "You look tired, Joe." The second time, outside a charity breakfast, Bradley running late, me standing in heels on cold brick pretending not to notice. Weston had paused beside me. "Is everything stable at home?" "Stable. Not happy. Not good. Stable." At the time I'd smiled and said, "Of course." Now I wondered if he'd already seen cracks I was still wallpapering over. At 4, my mother went upstairs for a blanket. My phone buzzed twice. Bradley. Then Bradley again. I turned it face down without reading either message. Simone texted once. Please let me explain, I didn't answer her either. By dawn, I had a banker's box from my mother's attic, filled with printouts, handwritten notes, and 3 changes of clothes. At 6:15, I called in sick to work for the first time in 4 years. Then I called a divorce attorney named Miriam Colfax, whose name got passed around among women in my field with the kind of respect usually reserved for surgeons. Her receptionist said Miriam could see me at 10 if it was urgent. "It's urgent," I said. Miriam Colfax's office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted row house on 2nd Street. Narrow staircase, original fireplace, windows too tall for modern blinds. She was in her late 50s, elegant in a severe way. Silver hair cut to her jaw, a voice that made every sentence sound pre-approved by a judge. She didn't waste the first 10 minutes telling me she was sorry. She asked me to start at the beginning. And because she was the first person in 12 hours who sounded like she cared more about sequence than sympathy, I trusted her immediately. I told her everything. The bedroom, the laptop, the transfer notation, the unsent email, Louise's delayed charitable disbursement, Bradley's questions about trust structure, Simone's access, and the fact that my husband had apparently decided my birthday was as good a night as any to combine adultery with financial misconduct in the same room. Miriam took notes in blue ink, capped her pen, and said, "Your husband sleeping with your best friend is ugly. Your husband using access to his mother's trust to move money is actionable." "What can I prove?" I asked. "Today, not enough for criminal charges. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But enough to make people very nervous. Enough to protect you. Enough to put his mother's trust administrator on alert before anything else disappears." We spent 90 minutes on what mattered most, not what hurt most, printed the email draft, captured the browser history, copied the trust files to a locked external drive, listed every shared account, every line of credit, every password Bradley might change the second he realized. I wasn't coming home to cry and negotiate. By noon, my marriage had been translated into a set of legal tasks. There was something clarifying about that. Miriam filed a temporary financial restraining order before lunch. Nothing dramatic, just enough to keep either of us from draining accounts while the divorce petition was prepared. She also drafted a careful letter to the Kessler Trust administrator, requesting an immediate internal review of recent disbursement activity, documenting only that confidential materials had possibly been improperly accessed. "Now," she said, folding the signed letter into a file, "there's the matter of Weston Kessler. I'd known his name would come up." "He's not a beneficiary in the primary sense," I said. "Louise is alive. He's the listed successor co-trustee if she becomes incapacitated," Miriam said. "If Bradley's touched anything in that trust, Weston will find out eventually one way or another. I'd rather he hear it from a source with evidence than from his brother with a rehearsed story." That was exactly what I'd have told a client. It was also exactly what I didn't want to do. Weston had always made me feel he could hear the sentence I wasn't saying. "You don't need to trust him emotionally," Miriam said, reading my face. "You need to decide whether he's likely to protect his mother's assets if given reason to believe they're in danger." "Yes," I said, before I could stop myself. The immediacy of that answer surprised me more than its truth. "Then call him. Keep it factual." I sat in my car outside Miriam's office for 6 minutes before dialing. He answered on the third ring. "Joe." "No hello, just my name, low and even, like he'd already been told there was trouble and was waiting to hear its shape. "Do you have 10 minutes? A pause. "Yes. I'm not calling about Bradley," I said. "I'm calling about Bradley and your mother's trust." Silence. Not confused silence. The kind that means a person has gone perfectly still. "Where are you?" "In my car outside Miriam Colfax's office." "I'm 15 minutes away. Stay there." He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't waste either of our time with outrage before facts. That should not have comforted me. It did anyway. Weston arrived in 11 minutes in a charcoal sedan, jacket off, tie loosened, still looking like a man who could walk into any courtroom in the state and make people sit straighter. He glanced once at my face, then the folder in my lap. What did he do? I handed him the printouts instead of answering. He read in silence, eyes moving across the pages, until he reached the subject line on the unsent email. "Need this before Weston sees quarterly statement." Something hard moved through his face and vanished so fast I might have imagined it, if I hadn't spent the last 15 hours studying people for fracture points. "When did you find this?" "Last night." "Were they together?" "Yes." He nodded once, filing that under tragic but secondary. "Has your mother-in-law been told?" "No." "Miriam wants the trust administrator alerted first, so there's a record before Bradley can spin anything." "Good." He set the papers back in order with meticulous care. "That's the right move." The relief I felt at those 4 words made me angry with myself. I didn't want to need his steadiness. I didn't want to sit in a parked car with my husband's brother and feel grateful because one man in that family still knew how to behave when a woman handed him evidence of betrayal. He looked at me directly, and for the first time since I'd walked into my bedroom, I felt the full weight of another person understanding the scale of what had happened. "I'm sorry." Not a broad apology. Exact. Apologizing for Bradley, for the trust, for the fact that my best friend had apparently helped his brother turn my marriage into a side room for theft. "Thank you," I said, because there was nothing else to do with a sincere sentence. "I've suspected for months he was asking questions he had no legitimate reason to ask," Weston said. "I didn't know how much access he'd already gotten. I should have pushed harder." "You knew." "I knew he was circling my mother's money. I didn't know he'd gotten close enough to touch it. That should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it made the last year rearrange itself in my mind. His strange questions at Christmas, the breakfast in February, the one time he'd interrupted Bradley at dinner to ask, very quietly, why he was so interested in sub-account distribution rules. "What happens now?" I asked. "You let Miriam do what you hired her to do." "I'll call the trust administrator myself. Tell him I want every transaction from the last 12 months reviewed. My mother will hear it from me, not Bradley." and Bradley won't be alone with her paperwork again. There was no bravado in the promise, just certainty. I nodded, then asked the question I hated myself for asking. Do you think he'll lie to everyone and make me sound unstable? Yes, he said, without hesitation. The honesty landed harder than comfort would have. And do you think it'll work? No, because Bradley has always mistaken confidence for credibility. He looked down at the papers, then back at me. And because you came to a lawyer before you came to a family argument. That tells me everything I need to know. I laughed, once, a short, broken sound that surprised us both. When he got out of the car, he paused with one hand on the doorframe. Joe, I'm not going to ask you to be generous to people who weren't generous with your life. Then he shut the door and walked back to his sedan, leaving me alone with a folder of evidence, a pending divorce, and the first unmistakable sense that Bradley Kessler had finally overreached in a direction even his own family couldn't ignore. By the end of that week, the trust administrator had frozen discretionary changes to Louise's charitable sub-account pending review. Simone had been quietly removed from any Kessler-linked file at the bank. Bradley called me 17 times, sent 6 increasingly aggrieved emails, and left one voicemail accusing me of trying to destroy his relationship with his mother over a personal mistake. He still thought the affair was the center of the story. The divorce was finalized the following February, 29 minutes after the judge called our case. 14 years of marriage reduced to less than half an hour in a courtroom with beige walls and weak hallway coffee. Bradley didn't contest it in the end. He fought long enough to make it expensive and exhausting, but not long enough to expose himself to the financial discovery Miriam kept hinting she'd pursue if he got theatrical. He agreed to sell the house, split the accounts, let me keep my grandmother's ring and the dining table my mother had bought us. Men like Bradley, Miriam observed dryly, often part with sentimental things more easily than they part with the illusion they're still in control. What he never admitted, not once, was that the trust issue had been anything more than a misunderstanding. He'd merely been helping his mother. Simone had only been clarifying procedures. The draft email was bad wording. The reverse transfer was a clerical error. The bank's internal review never became a criminal case. Not enough money was missing, and too much had been reversed before it settled anywhere irreversible. Simone lost her position at the trust office. Bradley was quietly removed from any informal role with Louise's paperwork. The trust was restructured so Weston had oversight on every discretionary distribution. There were meetings, signatures, phrases like, out of an abundance of caution. People with money are very good at building elegant language around family disgrace. It should have felt like justice. It felt like a first chapter. I moved into a narrow brick townhouse near downtown, small enough that silence couldn't hide in it. I bought new towels, a coffee maker, a basil plant I nearly killed within 6 weeks because grief and overwatering are close cousins. I went back to work, and that was the first thing that saved me. Probate law is excellent medicine for self-pity. Somebody is always having a worse week than you are, and they still need the deed filed by 4. For the first year, I saw Weston only at family-adjacent obligations and trust follow-up meetings I couldn't avoid. Louise asked me to lunch twice. I declined both times before accepting a third invitation, only because my mother pointed out that avoiding her forever would turn restraint into theater. Louise chose a tea room downtown, as if we were discussing flower arrangements instead of the fact that her younger son had detonated my marriage and nearly used her charitable fund as kindling. I was ashamed to ask you here, she said, after the waiter left. Then why did you? Because I need to say something my generation often says too late. She folded her napkin once. I wanted very badly to believe Bradley was merely weak. Weakness is easier to forgive than appetite. It was one of the only honest things she ever said to me. I didn't forgive her that day, but I respected her for naming the truth without softening it. Weston didn't intrude on my life after the divorce. That mattered more than any grand gesture could have. He didn't call under the pretense of checking on me. He behaved the way decent men behave when they understand timing can turn kindness into pressure. If we crossed paths, he asked how my mother was, whether tax season was still impossible, whether the basil had survived. Once, when my card reader was down at a coffee shop, he paid for me and said, "You can pay me back by keeping Louise from signing anything my brother puts in front of her." That was Weston. Dry where Bradley was glossy. Useful where Bradley was ornamental. The second year after the divorce, his wife got sick. Margot Kessler illustrated children's books and made every room feel more civilized simply by entering it. She and Weston had married late by Wilmington standards and had their daughter Nora, after years of trying. When Margot was diagnosed with acute leukemia, Nora wasn't yet 3. She died 9 months later, in early spring. I went to the memorial because not going would have been cruel. The chapel was full of white flowers and people speaking too softly. Weston stood near the front with Nora in his arms, his face so still it frightened me. Afterward, in the parish hall, I found myself kneeling beside a little girl in black patent shoes, fighting the wrapper off a granola bar with the fierce concentration of the recently bereaved. "You want help?" She looked up with her mother's dark eyes and nodded once. I opened the granola bar. She said thank you, then leaned against my knee while she ate. The way children lean on people who feel steady before the adults in the room have decided what's appropriate. Weston saw it from across the hall. Our eyes met over her head. Exhaustion in his face and gratitude, and something else I refused to name. A month later, Louise called and asked if I'd sit with Nora for 2 hours one Saturday while Weston met with Margot's estate attorney. "I know it's not your responsibility," she said before I could answer, and I wouldn't ask if I had another option that felt kind. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I understood too well how women become useful to families that once failed them. Then I pictured Nora in those patent shoes with the granola bar, and I said yes. Nora colored at my kitchen table while I made grilled cheese. She was 3.5, solemn the way children get after loss, watching a room before she trusted it. She called me Miss Joe. She liked the yellow crayons best. "You don't have to do this again," Weston said, standing in my doorway with a diaper bag over one shoulder. "I know." Nora took his hand, then looked back at me. "Can I come next Saturday too?" That was how it began, not with romance. With soup cooling on the stove, a child choosing the yellow crayons, and a widower too exhausted to pretend he wasn't grateful. By autumn, Nora knew where I kept the juice boxes. By Christmas, she fell asleep on my couch during a storm while Weston sat across from us pretending to read. By the following spring, she'd started calling me my Joe T, the possessive way children do when they're quietly staking a claim. And somewhere in the middle of all that, without spectacle or permission, my life began rebuilding itself around a man who never once asked me to perform forgiveness, and a little girl who had no idea she was teaching me how to want a future again. Then, one Thursday 4 years and some change after I walked in on Bradley and Simone, I got a voicemail from a number I'd deleted but never truly forgotten. "Joe, it's Simone. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I'm in a restitution program now, and part of it means making amends where I can. There's something Bradley did that your lawyer never found, something tied to Louise's trust and another account. I think you need to hear it from me before someone else gets hurt." I listened to the message twice. I didn't delete it. Because 5 years earlier, I'd learned that when a person who helped bury the truth calls to say there's more underground, you don't hang up on the grave. You bring a shovel. My cousin Marianne's wedding fell on the first Saturday in October, the kind of Carolina autumn day people spend the rest of the year describing badly. Clear blue sky, that hard-edged brightness you only get after the humidity finally gives up. The reception tent glowed from inside even before sunset. Cream fabric and strung lights, making everyone look slightly more forgiving than they really were. I drove out with Nora in the back seat, a garment bag on the passenger hook, because Weston had been called into an emergency chambers meeting that morning and promised he'd come straight from the courthouse as soon as he could. He'd kissed Nora's forehead in my kitchen at 7:30, kissed me too quickly because he was already late, and said, "Don't let Marianne feed our kid, only wedding cake before I get there." Our kid. He'd said it casually, distracted, searching for his keys while thinking about a federal docket. I carried those 2 words with me the whole drive. Nora was 5 by then, all serious dark eyes and honey-brown curls that refused to stay in any barrette for longer than 15 minutes, wearing a pale yellow dress with tiny embroidered flowers at the hem. She'd decided 3 days earlier that I should wear my hair down because it made me look like a princess lawyer. By the time we reached the venue, Marianne pulled me into a one-armed hug the moment I stepped through the door. "You look beautiful," she said, then glanced down at Nora. "And you, little miss, are going to break hearts by kindergarten." She waited until Nora wandered toward a tray of fruit skewers before lowering her voice. "There's something you need to know before you go out there." I knew from her face this wasn't about centerpieces. "Bradley is here," she said. "And Simone." For a second, the room blurred into white satin and distant violin tuning. "Simone," I repeated. Marianne nodded. "She called me 2 weeks ago, said she needed to make amends with several people, asked if she could come quietly since she used to know me and Patrick through you and Bradley. I told her no at first. Then she called again and said she had information involving Bradley and your old trust mess. I didn't know what to do with that, so I told her she could come to the reception only, not the ceremony, and only if she stayed away from you unless you agreed otherwise." "And Bradley?" Marianne's mouth tightened. "Invited because Patrick still sees him occasionally through business contacts, and because Louise asked if leaving him out would create a bigger scene than including him." I said yes, probably. I'm not proud of that answer. Only a small circle knew the full shape of my life by then: my mother, Marianne, Louise, a few close friends. Weston and I had been engaged for 3 months but hadn't made a broad announcement, because Nora was still settling into the language of us. She'd started calling me mommy in private about 6 weeks earlier, after a nightmare, and we'd let the name come when it came rather than turning it into a ceremony. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows, October wind, and Nora whispering questions about whether flower girls got paid. Bradley and Simone didn't attend it. But by the time the reception began, I saw him near the bar. Charcoal suit, wine-colored tie, hair thinner than I remembered, fine lines around his mouth I hadn't put there. He still wore himself like a man who believed rooms belonged to him if he entered smiling. A woman I didn't know stood beside him, hand resting a little too deliberately on his arm. He saw me at the same moment I saw him, and I watched the old instinct settle over his face like a stage light. My mother, seated beside me, set down her champagne. "If he embarrasses himself at Marianne's wedding, I'm too old to stop myself from helping. Please don't get arrested in silk," I said. "No promises." Bradley reached our table with the smooth ease of a man approaching a former audience, not a former wife. "Joe, you look well." "Bradley, I've been meaning to say hello all evening. Didn't want to intrude." "You're intruding now." That should have warned him off. Instead, it sharpened him. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time with my family," he said lightly. Then, softer, calibrated for witnesses, "Life's funny, isn't it? 5 years ago I thought leaving you would be a disaster. Turns out it was the best decision I ever made." There it was, the line. My mother turned toward him so sharply, her chair scraped the floor. I touched her wrist under the table before she could stand. I opened my mouth to tell him to leave. I never got the chance. "Mommy!" Nora came flying out from the children's activity table, yellow skirt bouncing, curls half fallen from their ribbons. She threw both arms around my waist and pressed her cheek into my side. "I love you. Miss Renee gave me 2 cookies and I only ate 1 because I'm saving the other for Daddy." The silence around us was immediate and absolute. Bradley's face changed first. Not much, just enough. His eyes dropped to Nora, lifted to me, dropped again, the dawning horror of a man's vanity colliding with arithmetic he hadn't expected to do in public. He knew Nora was too old to be his. He knew I'd never had children with him. And he'd just heard her call me mommy in a room full of Kesslers. "Joe," he said, and for the first time all evening there was no performance in his voice. "Who is this?" The tent flap opened behind me. I heard the step before I turned, the quiet, measured stride I'd come to know over hospital hallways and courthouse corridors and my own kitchen at 7 in the morning. Weston walked in, tie loosened, jacket unbuttoned, the October dusk at his back, and found Nora first, then me, then Bradley. Nora twisted and squealed, "Daddy!" Weston crossed the floor, bent and scooped her up. She planted a folded cocktail napkin on his shoulder like a medal. "You made it through cocktail hour," I said, barely. His hand settled at the back of my chair. My ring caught the light. Bradley saw the ring. The child. The way Nora reached for me even balanced on Weston's hip. The way Weston's body had angled toward mine without thought, like that space beside him already belonged to me. "What the hell is this?" he said. No one answered. Then, from the far side of the tent, a woman's voice cut through the silence. "No, Bradley, the better question is what you did." Simone stood near the edge of the tent in a slate blue dress that had probably been elegant when she bought it, and now hung on her like a compromise. Every head turned toward her. Bradley froze. The fact that his daughterless ex-wife was standing beside his brother while a 5-year-old called her mommy, or the fact that the woman he'd once helped destroy her life with had just opened her mouth in public. "Simone," he said, the old warning tone, "this isn't the place." She laughed once softly. "No, it's exactly the place. You've always liked an audience." Weston set Nora down gently. "Why don't you take that cookie to Grandma Louise? Miss Renee can show you the dessert table." Nora trotted off, and I let myself turn back to the room. "I'm not here to ruin Marianne's wedding," Simone said, her voice trembling with the effort of speaking at all. "I'm here because 5 years ago I helped ruin someone else's life, and then spent those same 5 years helping Bradley pretend he was unlucky instead of dishonest." Bradley stepped toward her. Weston moved without drama, just enough to put himself half a pace forward, a quiet line drawn on the floor. "Stay where you are." Bradley stopped. "The affair was real," Simone said, and several people flinched at hearing it stated plainly. "It lasted almost 2 years. I told myself it started because Bradley understood me, and Joe had outgrown me, and I was tired of being the side character in my own life. Those were the stories I used to keep from admitting the truth, which was uglier. Bradley wanted access, and I wanted to be chosen. That's a dangerous combination." She swallowed. "I worked in trust administration. I had access to file structures, account notes, internal routing. I wasn't supposed to share any of it. At first, I didn't. Then Bradley started asking about Louise's charitable sub-account, how distributions were approved, what oversight Weston had, whether temporary relocations would trigger alerts if reversed before the quarterly statement closed. A murmur moved through the tent. "This is insane," Bradley said. "No," Simone said, looking at him. "It was fraud. It just happened in increments small enough that you thought you could outrun the word." She pulled a slim white envelope and a flash drive from her clutch, her hand shaking. "After Joe found us, Bradley panicked and reversed the first transfer. That's the one she found on the laptop. But it wasn't the only one. It wasn't even the worst one." Her eyes shifted to me. "There was another account, linked through a donor-advised fund your father-in-law set up years ago. Bradley used information I gave him to move money temporarily through a side entity connected to one of his business interests. He told me it was a bridge. He'd replace it before anyone saw the statement, that no one would lose anything if I just helped one more time." My stomach went cold. Miriam had suspected there was more. I had suspected there was more. But suspicion and hearing it out loud are different things. "How much?" Weston asked. "Enough that if the market had dipped at the wrong time, or one payment had been delayed, Louise would have noticed. Enough that if Bradley hadn't gotten lucky twice, it would have become criminal 5 years ago." "You were the one with access," Bradley snapped. Simone gave him a look stripped entirely of affection. "And there it is. That's what he always did. Found the hunger in people and fed it just enough to make them useful. Then the moment anything cracked, he handed them the bill." She turned back to the room. "I'm in a restitution program now, because what I did cost me my job, my license, and almost every relationship I had left. This," she lifted the envelope, "contains copies of emails, internal note logs, and transaction records from the second account Bradley used. The flash drive has the same files, plus a voicemail he left me after Joe filed for divorce, telling me to keep the story straight, reminding me that if Louise believed Joe had touched the paperwork first, no one would look too closely at him." For one suspended second, nobody breathed. "He told Louise I might have touched her trust," I said. Simone nodded, her face folding. "Yes, that hurt landed strangely. Not louder than the affair, not even sharper, just deeper. It slid beneath the old wound and found the place where dignity lives." All those months, Louise's voice had gone cool on the phone. The lunch where she'd seemed ashamed but wouldn't say why. Bradley had let his own mother suspect me because suspicion was a cheaper shield than honesty. Louise made a small, wounded sound and covered her mouth. "You're doing this because you're broke," Bradley said to Simone, but the force had gone out of him. "You need someone to blame." "No," she said. "I'm doing it because for 5 years I woke up every morning knowing that the best person in my life had been the one I chose to betray. And the worst man I ever met had convinced me that being loved by him was worth becoming someone I couldn't stand." Miriam Colfax stepped out from a table near the back, where, to my astonishment, she'd apparently been sitting most of the reception with a glass of white wine and the patience of a woman who knew exactly when her entrance would matter. "May I?" she asked, extending a hand toward the envelope. Simone handed it over. Miriam scanned the top page, looked up at Weston. "This is enough to reopen the financial side properly. Whether it becomes civil, criminal, or both depends on what the full records show. But yes, this is real." Bradley lunged then, not dramatically, just the ugly reflex of a man watching the last wall collapse. He grabbed Simone's wrist, hard enough to make her gasp. "Take your hand off her," Weston said. Not loud. It didn't need to be. Bradley looked at his brother. And for the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear land before anger. He let go, red marks already blooming on her skin. Patrick was there a second later, then 2 venue staff, then one of Weston's old law school friends with the build of a retired linebacker. It took less than 15 seconds for Bradley Kessler, who'd spent his adult life believing he could talk his way to the center of any room, to be walked toward the tent flap, like a man who'd finally discovered some story's charm cannot outshout. He twisted once at the entrance and looked back at me. "You think this means you won?" I stood there, in my dark green dress, hands steady at my sides. "This stopped being about winning the day you decided my life was collateral," I said. "The only difference now is that everyone else knows it too." He stared. Patrick touched his elbow. The flap opened and Bradley was gone. No applause followed. Real life is rarely that tidy. People exhaled. Marianne cried quietly into Patrick's shoulder, because it was still her wedding, and there's something especially cruel about family truth, choosing your happiest day to become public property. Weston crossed to the band leader and asked for something slower. Not to erase what had happened, but to give the room somewhere to put its pulse. I walked to Simone before I'd fully decided to. She lifted her chin like she expected me to slap her. I didn't. "Why now?" "Because my counselor asked me what the difference was between remorse and self-pity," she said. "I realized I'd spent years confusing the two. It isn't enough to fix anything. It isn't even enough to forgive. But it's honest." Louise approached slowly, Nora's hand in hers. "I owe you an apology I should have made years ago," she said to me. "I let myself believe weakness where there was appetite. Worse, I let myself doubt the wrong person. There are apologies that ask to be absolved, and apologies that merely place truth where it should have been all along. This was the second kind. "I know," I said. "It was all I had to give. For once it was enough." Nora tugged my hand. "Mommy, are you sad?" I knelt to her eye level. "No, sweetheart, I'm okay." That was true. In a way, it hadn't been for a very long time. A few months later, Miriam called to say the records Simone provided had done exactly what she thought they would. Bradley's business accounts were subpoenaed. Louise's advisors filed civil claims. There was talk of wire fraud and fiduciary misconduct, if the numbers lined up. Simone entered a formal cooperation agreement. I didn't ask for every update after that. There are endings you don't need to watch frame by frame once the truth has finally chosen its side. I married Weston the following spring, in my mother's garden, under the dogwood tree where my father once hung a porch swing. Nora scattered petals with solemn concentration. Louise brought lemon bars and never mentioned the wedding tent once. Life didn't become perfect after that. Families rarely do. Nora still has nights when she misses Margot so badly she cries into my shirt until it's damp at the collar. Weston still carries grief in quiet places. I still have mornings when a certain perfume on a stranger in the grocery store catches me off guard. But pain stopped being the center of the story. One evening, almost a year after Marianne's wedding, I stood at the stove making grilled cheese while Nora colored a princess holding a judge's gavel. Her latest theory about her father's profession, and looked up. "Mommy, can I have the yellow crayon back?" Just like that. No fanfare, no milestone speech. I handed it to her. "Only if you promise not to color on Daddy's court files." She grinned. No promises. From the doorway, Weston laughed. Sometimes people ask, after they've heard some version of this story, whether seeing Bradley humiliated at that wedding felt satisfying. The honest answer is yes, but not for the reasons they expect. It wasn't satisfying because he suffered. It was satisfying because the room finally saw what I'd carried alone. Because the lie I'd once been asked to live inside could no longer survive daylight. Because 5 years after he looked me in the eye and told me, leaving me was the best decision he ever made. He had to stand in the middle of a life I'd rebuilt without him, and watch every important thing choose me anyway. If you've ever had to leave quietly while someone louder rewrote the story, I hope you remember this. Silence is not surrender. Time is not defeat, and the truth has a patient way of finding the room where it belongs. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, or whether you've ever had to rebuild after someone thought they'd broken you for good. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, about betrayal, second chances, and the kind of strength that doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. There are a lot of journeys left to take together.